Before there was power, there was hunger. The men who built the American Mafia did not start in hotel suites and back rooms. They started in two-room tenement apartments on Mulberry Street and East 116th Street and Stillwell Avenue in Brooklyn, where 10 people shared one stove and the rent came out of whatever was left after the food. Their fathers worked in mines and on docks for wages that barely cleared $2 a day. Their mothers fed large families from almost nothing, stretching bones into broth, turning stale bread into meals, making bitterness edible with garlic and olive oil, and enough time on the stove. The 20 dishes on this list are the food of those kitchens, the food of the Italian immigrant neighborhoods of New York and Chicago between 1900 and 1940, the food that fed Al Capone as a child in Brooklyn, Lucky Luciano on the Lower East Side, Carlo Gambino in Bensonhurst, Tony Accardo on the near west side of Chicago. The food of poverty that became the foundation of everything that came after. Number 14 is the dish that appears in more mob memoirs, courtroom testimonies, and FBI surveillance logs than any other single food. Number 7 is what every Italian immigrant mother made on Friday when there was no money for meat. And number 1 is the meal that never left the table. Not when the money came, not when the power came, not when the men who grew up eating it were photographed in silk suits in front of the most expensive restaurants in Manhattan. Let's count down all 20. Item 20, Aqua E-Sale. Water, salt, and stale bread. Stale bread broken into a bowl, soaked in water, seasoned with coarse salt. Eaten when the pantry was empty and payday was 2 days away. Not a recipe. A fact of life in the tenement kitchens of the Lower East Side in the early 1900s. The men who would later order meals at the finest restaurants in New York remembered this. Some of them never talked about it. All of them remembered it. Item 19, pane e cipolla. Bread and raw onion. A thick slice of coarse Italian bread rubbed with a raw onion until the bread absorbed the juice, a drizzle of olive oil, a pinch of salt. The dock workers and factory hands of the Italian immigrant neighborhoods ate this at midday from paper bags on street corners. Their sons ate it too, in the years before those sons decided that physical labor was not the life they intended. The onion on the bread was the first lesson in making something from nothing. Some of them turned out to be very fast learners. Item 18, minestra di pane. Bread soup. Every piece of stale bread in an Italian immigrant kitchen went into a pot. Broken into chunks, dropped into boiling salted water with garlic, olive oil, and whatever vegetables were at the bottom of the crate, simmered until the bread dissolved and thickened the broth. Nothing wasted, nothing thrown away. The men who grew up in those kitchens carried that accounting instinct into everything they built afterward. Waste was a moral failure before it was a financial one. Item 17, pasta e patate. Pasta and potatoes. Diced potatoes cooked with garlic, olive oil, canned tomatoes, and small pasta until the starchy water thickens the pot into something between a soup and a stew. Two of the cheapest ingredients available, combined into a filling meal. Vito Genovese, born near Naples in 1897, ate this on the streets of Little Italy before he became one of the most feared men in American organized crime. The pasta e patate was on his mother's stove. It was on every mother's stove. Item 16, fagioli all'uccelletto. White beans with garlic, sage, and tomato. Cannellini beans simmered with garlic, fresh sage, crushed tomatoes, and olive oil until the pot thickens. A dish that costs almost nothing and feeds 6 people from one pot. The bean was the protein of the Italian immigrant poor, bought in bulk from pushcart vendors on the Essex Street Market. In lean weeks, beans were the meal, not the side. The men who later ran the numbers rackets and loan sharking operations of the American Mafia grew up eating beans 3 nights a week. They understood from childhood what it meant to need something. Item 15, lardo e pane. Cured pork fat on bread. Lardo, cured back fat seasoned with rosemary and garlic, aged until it melts on the tongue, sliced thin and laid across warm bread. The pork stores on Mulberry Street and Arthur Avenue sold it by the ounce to families who couldn't afford the meat but could afford the fat. It provided dense, efficient calories sufficient to sustain a man through a working day. Every future mob boss in New York grew up knowing which pork store to trust. That knowledge transferred directly into the organizations they built. Item 14. Pasta e fagioli. Pasta and beans. The dish in more mob testimony than any other. White cannellini beans, ditalini pasta, tomato, garlic, a ham hock, a parmesan rind. Thick enough that a spoon stands in it. Present in every Southern Italian and Sicilian household from the Lower East Side to Bensonhurst to the near West Side of Chicago. And in more mob memoirs, courtroom testimonies, and FBI surveillance logs than any other single food. Lucky Luciano ate it. Carlo Gambino ate it. Tony Accardo ate it. Sammy Gravano ate it from a chipped bowl in the back of a social club. 40 years after the tenement years, when he was underboss of the most powerful crime family in New York, the dish didn't change. The men eating it did. Item 13. Polenta. Cornmeal porridge. The food of the northern Italian poor. Coarsely ground cornmeal stirred for 45 minutes in boiling salted water, poured onto a wooden board and sliced with a string, eaten with a fried egg, a few beans, or a spoonful of tomato sauce. The staple of Lombardy and the Veneto. The food that kept the rural poor alive through long northern winters. The Lucchese family's roots ran through northern Italian immigrant communities in the Bronx. Polenta on a wooden board, eaten with bread, was not poverty to these families. It was dinner. Item 12. Ciabatta. Vegetable stew. Whatever was at the bottom of the crate. Eggplant, zucchini, peppers, potatoes, and tomatoes. Whatever was overripe. Whatever the vendor was selling cheaply at the end of market day. Cut into rough pieces and cooked down in olive oil with garlic. A Calabrian and Neapolitan stew of pure improvisation. No fixed recipe, just vegetables at the edge of usability turned edible by heat and time. The Colombo family's roots ran through Calabrian immigrant communities in Brooklyn. The women of those communities made ciabatta from what the week had left over. Nothing was thrown away. Everything became the next meal. Item 11. Frittata di cipolle. Onion frittata. Onions cooked low in olive oil for 20 minutes until sweet and almost jammy, eggs poured over, and cooked until set, flipped once. A meal that could feed a family from 2 eggs if the onion was generous. It held. It traveled in paper. It was the food of men eating standing up before a day's work, and children brought lunch by their mothers in a wrapped cloth. Before any of them were anything, they were fed on this. Item 10. Trippa alla Romana. Tripe in tomato sauce. Beef tripe cleaned and simmered for hours in tomato sauce, with onion, celery, carrot, and pecorino romano until it softens and absorbs the sauce completely. Offal was what remained after the wealthy took the prime cuts. In the butcher shops of Mulberry Street, tripe was the cheapest meat available. Italian immigrant families bought it because they had always bought it in the villages they came from. Men who have eaten offal as children are not squeamish about much. Item 9. Zuppa di scarola e fagioli. Escarole and bean soup. Escarola. The bitter Neapolitan green, torn and dropped into a light broth with cannellini beans, garlic, and olive oil. 15 minutes, almost no cost. Frank Costello, born in Calabria and raised in East Harlem, ate this as a child. So did Vito Genovese. The soup cost almost nothing. The neighborhoods where it was eaten produced the entire senior leadership of what became the Genovese crime family. Item 8. Pane cunzato. Dressed bread. Sicilian street food. A split loaf rubbed with a ripe tomato until the crumb turns red and wet dressed with olive oil, dried oregano, salt, and anchovy fillets. Lucky Luciano, Carlo Gambino, and the Sicilian contingent of the American Mafia grew up eating this in Brooklyn and on the Lower East Side, made the way their mothers made it in Palermo. No plate, no fork, eaten in two hands, standing at the kitchen counter. The simplest possible food made by people getting through the day. Item 7. Bacala frito. Fried salt cod. The Friday meal without exception. Salt cod soaked 48 hours, dipped in flour batter, fried in oil until golden. The Friday meal in every Italian immigrant household without exception. The Catholic prohibition on meat honored every single week, regardless of finances. Bacala was one of the cheapest proteins in the neighborhood markets. The Friday fish was not a tradition in these kitchens. It was a rule. The men who grew up under it carried the sense of non-negotiable structure into everything they built afterward. Item 6. Pasta al pomodoro. Pasta with tomato sauce, 4 times a week. Crushed canned tomatoes, garlic slow in olive oil, dried basil if fresh wasn't there, the cheapest pasta on sale. Not the Sunday gravy, the Tuesday dinner, the Thursday lunch, the meal that appeared on the table 4 times a week in tenement apartments across every Italian neighborhood in New York in the first half of the 20th century. It followed the second generation, the bosses, the underbosses, the capos, onto their own tables for the rest of their lives, not because they couldn't afford anything else, because it tasted like home. Item 5. Salsiccia e friarielli. Pork sausage with bitter broccoli rabe. Fat pork sausage with fennel and black pepper crisped in a cast iron pan, braised with bitter friarielli that soaks up the pork fat and wilts dark and savory. The sausage came from the neighborhood pork store. Cheapest cut, most flavorful. The friarielli grew wild along fences in East Harlem and Bensonhurst. The cast iron pan was the one piece of equipment every Italian immigrant kitchen owned. Passed down, never replaced. It outlasted everything. Item 4. Maco di fave. Crushed fava bean soup, the food of the deepest poverty. Dried fava beans boiled until they dissolve, crushed into a rough puree, seasoned with olive oil and wild bitter greens. An ancient dish from the poorest parts of Sicily and Calabria. What the contadini ate when the grain harvest failed and there was nothing else. It appeared on the tables of the same Brooklyn and Lower East Side households that produced the first generation of American mafia leadership. The fava bean was the protein of last resort. The men who grew up eating it were not easily discouraged. Item 3. Ribollita. Reboiled bread and bean soup. Better the second day. Cannellini beans, cavolo nero, stale bread, carrots, celery, tomatoes, olive oil, cooked, then reboiled the next day until the bread dissolves and the soup becomes almost solid. Better the second day. Better still the third. The principle of Ribollita is the principle of the tenement kitchen. Nothing is wasted, everything improves by returning to it. The soup you couldn't finish yesterday becomes the better meal today. You don't throw away what can be used again. You put it back on the heat and you wait. Item 2. Polpette di pane. Bread meatballs. Meat extended as far as it would go. A small amount of cheap ground meat extended with a large amount of soaked stale bread, egg, pecorino romano, parsley, and garlic. A pound of meat becoming 3 pounds of meatballs, feeding 10 people instead of 3. Performed by women who had done it their whole lives and whose mothers had done it before them. When the money came, the bosses made the meatballs with all meat, but every single one of them knew the bread version. Every one of them had eaten it as a child. The real recipe and the prosperous recipe were both on the table in different decades in the same kitchens. Item 1. Ragu della Domenica, Sunday gravy, the meal that never left. Pork ribs, sausage, and meatballs browned in lard, San Marzano tomatoes. The heat drops, 4 hours. In the tenement years, Sunday gravy was the one day of the week the family ate meat, the day the pot was full, the day the table held enough for everyone. The smell of it, rendered pork, and garlic at 8 in the morning was the smell of Sunday in every Italian immigrant neighborhood in America. The men who left those neighborhoods and built the American Mafia kept the Sunday table, every single one of them. Carlo Gambino, home every Sunday in Massapequa. Tony Accardo, home every Sunday in River Forest. Lucky Luciano, eating Sunday ragu with Ijea Lissoni at an apartment overlooking the Gulf of Naples. Sammy Gravano, eating it from his daughter's stove in Valley Stream after everything. The Sunday gravy was not nostalgia. It was not sentiment. It was proof that some things survive everything you do. The poverty that built these men, the violence that defined them, the prisons that held them, none of it touched the Sunday table. The gravy was on the stove. The family was at the table. Everything else was something that happened during the week.